This is Wake Up Wyoming. My name's Glenn Woods, News Director. Nick sitting across from me on the phone with me, Governor Mark Gordon. Thanks for joining us yet again for another town hall. You've been on every one of these so far, and I really appreciate the time that you're putting into letting the state know what's going on with all of these important issues. Good morning.
Well, good morning to both of you, and really enjoy the opportunity, so thanks.
Thanks for being here, Governor.
The state of Wyoming has had boom bust, of course, in the energy industry before. In fact, we were even going through one just as soon as you took office. But then this happened. So this is completely unprecedented, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, we've had substantial declines before, going back to the 70s. And, you know, during the 1980s was probably one of the biggest ones the state has ever seen, up until about 2016. And 2016, of course, everything collapsed, and then we just started to recover. And again, here we go, once again into another kind of challenge. And then you add to that, how's 2020 so far? You've got the pandemic, you've got social unrest, you've got the Saudis and the Russians going at it tooth and tongue, and it's...
What you're saying is 2020 sucks.
Yeah.
Okay.
Governor, I wanted to ask, just before we get into some of the particulars here, you talked about some of the historic booms and busts Wyoming has been through, dependent on fossil fuel production and that revenue for state government. How bad is this current situation? I mean, we're talking about special sessions of the legislature. You're talking about additional budget cuts. So exactly how deep is the problem here?
Well, it's serious. It's particularly difficult right now because oil has taken a real hit. It's starting to come back a little bit, but there are marks that are being left. We went from 27 rigs in March down to one operating, and once those rigs are stacked, it takes a while to come back. The labor force gets scattered. It's really a challenge. We do hope that July we'll see a little bit of a recovery in oil. Coal is down to 1975 levels, but there are contracts that lay out over the course of the next several years. We're very anxious to make sure those contracts stay in place. We've been working very hard to do that, but really right across the sector, with the only possible sort of uptick being in uranium and nuclear production, because finally this country decided, domestic supply of uranium is actually important.
And as far as the government's role here, so I mean, when things are good, when the market's functioning the way that all the producers would like it to, the conversation is, hey, let's get government out of the way and let these businesses do what they would naturally and profit and provide state revenue to Wyoming. When things are not so good, the question is, well, what can government do? And I guess that's my question for you.
Sure. Well, we've done a number of things. We rolled back the conservation tax. We have done our best to make sure that our permitting processes are as quick as possible. We've done our best, actually, to keep our workforce up and working. That's why Wyoming has the third lowest unemployment rate in the nation. We're relatively safe, but I have to say there's only a limit to what government can do. Mm-hmm. We can reduce regulations, we can reduce the taxes on business, we can try to stimulate business, but we're really looking at significant reductions in the services that government can provide, and of course that has an economic impact as well. If government is having to cut things like school funding, and we've heard a lot about the closure of the rest areas. We closed rest areas that were within 5 miles of town, so we could drive, people that would stop there to businesses in those towns, or if the town wanted to take over those rest stops, they could. But that's one of the things that we're hearing about is, how can you close those? Well, we couldn't afford to keep them open.
So you have to take a look at not just the size and functionality of government in this, but also revenue streams, because I keep hearing rumblings about, well, we might have to, and you and I have talked about this before, we might have to diversify how the state of Wyoming brings in revenue to government coffers.
Absolutely, Glenn. As you and I've talked before, we really have an enormous dependence on the energy sector. Absolutely essential. Going back a couple of years, and I think it's probably still pretty true. For every $3,000 in taxes a family of four pays, they get about $30,000 in services. And if the energy sector is reeling, as it is, that's obviously got to change. Now, we've done a lot over the last several years to make sure that our investments are performing at a better rate than they ever have before, and they continue to do pretty well. But even there, the stock market is kind of disconnected, I would say, from the regular economy, and so it's a little bit precarious. And then, of course, we're at the lowest interest rate in time. So it's a challenging time right now.
And on the topic of the state budget, Governor, you mentioned education. I think that's probably what comes to the top of mind for a lot of folks when we talk about additional potential cuts to state funding. We've made some cuts, not just to education, but across the board. I mean, even in your most recent budget proposal to the legislature that they worked on back in February. So, in your opinion, what should the legislature do? What should state government do to adjust the budget based on the way that revenue has declined from fossil fuels?
Well, we're looking, I think I've mentioned this before, we're looking at 10% cuts. In a couple of days, we'll come out with what those cuts are going to be really across the board, and there's some significant ones. We're looking at an additional 10%, so a total 20% reduction. 1/5 of our budget reduced. We've lost about a third of our income, and so there's more work for the legislature to do. And I guess what I'd like to stress is that this is not a one-year sort of thing. Right now, we have COVID-related dollars that are coming in to help, stand up schools with more PPE and better facilities for broadband, etc. But that funding goes away on the 31st of December. So this legislative session is going to be a very challenging one, where we're going to have to think about what are really essential services for the state of Wyoming. And those are going to have significant consequences into all of our towns and all of our counties, because we just can't fund things the way that we used to.
And my understanding was that they had talked about a session at the end of this month. I guess that would have been the last couple of days, and they decided against that. So is there a special session, a second one of this year, forthcoming?
Well, we've talked consistently, the executive branch, with the leadership of the legislature. They polled the legislature generally, and the assumption was, with the flexibility that we gave you on this last special session, can we make it through to the end of the year? And there's obviously quite a bit, about half the year left. And so at this point, it doesn't seem like it's necessary. We have the ability to move. The governor has the ability to make some changes in how the budget allocations work with these CARES funding proposals, and I think we can really make our way through to December without another session. But of course, if something comes up in the interim, there's a lot of this year yet to play out. We see cases rising with COVID. We don't know what the economic impacts. We have no idea what an election year is going to bring. And so it's nice to know that we're working hand in glove with the legislature. I try to keep the legislature abreast of everything that we're doing, so that if we do need to have another session, nobody's going into it, without some understanding of what the challenges are and what we need to do.
Yes, sir.
Okay, well, we're coming up on the next commercial break, Governor. Thank you for coming on. You're with me in noticing a rumbling out there about the possible uptick in uranium. If that happens, maybe you and I should go out and take a look at investing in some abandoned property in Jeffrey City. We can make a fortune on that, huh?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, Governor, thanks for coming on.
Hey, thanks, Governor.
716, Wake Up Wyoming.